Well, we've come to the last of our studies on trying to understand and get to grips with the acts of the sinful nature. And this study 5 is to look at two sins of intemperance. Okay, and the two sins of intemperance are drunkenness, which the New English Bible puts down as drinking bouts, and orgies, which the King James Version talks about revelling. The New American Standard Bible as carousing. When we use the word orgies, we tend to think of sexual orgies, but I don't necessarily think the word means that. It's well, excessive eating, excessive drinking, and excessive partying, I suppose. But let's have a look at what we learn. So drunkenness is talking about drinking bouts, getting drunk. Now, drinking wine is not a sin. Remember, our Lord turned water into wine, and when they tasted it, the person who was in charge of the banquet called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till last." Well, even some of those guests at that wedding in Cana looked like they had, it was the habit of having too much to drink. I'll come back to that later. But you have to think about what he says to Timothy too. Timothy was suffering from stomach problems. And the Lord, Paul writes this to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5, verse 23. He says this to him: "Stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses." The water was not necessarily pure, but the wine, because of the fermentation process, would actually kill much of the bacteria. And goodness knows what exactly his stomach problems were, but it was safer to drink wine than it was actually to drink the water. There's another thing you should notice about the wine, is that in those days, the wine would have been fermented by the natural yeast in the grapes. That would have meant the wine would have been, by our standards, not very alcoholic, maybe 3, 4, 5%. I mean, some of our wines nowadays are up to 12, 13, 14, 14.5%. You can't drink much of those before, well, gosh, you're all over the place. But I always remember a friend talking to me about some of Dickens' writings and other things, how they'd go out to lunch and drink a bottle of wine with lunch. But it wasn't a bottle of wine that we have like today. That would have been one of those low alcohol wines. And so the wine that you read about them drinking in the New Testament is a very low alcoholic wine, but still it could be quite well, what does he say in Ephesians 5:18? "Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery." So people did get drunk on it, and people purposely went out to drink, well, maybe gallons of it. Gallon may be an overestimate, but pints of it certainly. In that society there was the god of wine, and Dionysius, he was known as in Greek, I think, and Bacchus in Roman. And the worship in his temples involved consuming large quantities of alcohol and getting drunk. So people would go down to Bacchus's temple for a drinking bout. And what about drinking bouts today? Well, it's not unknown for young men to go away for the weekend to somewhere like Spain, where the alcohol is free, and spend, well, alcohol's not free, sorry, it's cheaper, I should say, not free, gosh, no, cheaper, and drink stacks of it and get, as they say, blotto. So they go off for a weekend and have these excessive drinking bouts. So there's nothing new under the sun. Binge drinking took place in Greek Roman society, and it takes place today. Now, orgies. Well, Kamaya is a natural companion of drunkenness. As we said, do not get drunk with wine, which leads to debauchery. And it can lead to, sexual orgies, I think. And it certainly was a characteristic feature of pagan society. And Peter has to write to the Jews scattered amongst the Gentiles and tell them off. "You have spent enough time," he says in 1 Peter 4:3, "in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, there's the word, and detestable idolatry. So were some of these Jews going down to these pagan temples like Bacchus and getting drunk as can be, I suppose? I don't really know. But see, it's amazing to think that, people who had been brought up on the law of Moses and knew something of the true God could actually behave like that. But maybe there's a lesson for us in that, is that it's not too difficult if you're living in a society where everyone around you has different standards to you, that you can lapse. You can lapse. But it's not, as I said, it's not necessarily associated with sexual orgies, but rather with excessive drinking or excessive eating or excessive partying. That's what it's talking about, losing control, if you like. In Philippians 3:18-19, he says, "For, as I have often told you before, and now tell you again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ." So not only was Peter write to some of these Jewish people, telling them that oh, look at you, you're behaving like the pagans. He's talking about some Christians now, Paul is, whether they were Jewish Christians or Gentile Christians, or probably both. They were living as enemies of Christ. Their destiny is destruction. Their God is their stomach, and they glory in their shame. Their mind is set on earthly things. Well, I don't know any Christians like this, but I do know people of the world who come back and boast. Oh, I drank 12 pints of beer. Oh, I beat that. I drank 14. Oh, I drank 18. They're boasting. They glory. Oh yeah, I got so drunk I couldn't remember anything. Oh, that's fantastic, wasn't it? You must have had a good night. No, you must have had a very bad night. So these are the sort of things that were going on in Philippi, and they're the sort of things that go on today, I'm afraid. So their mind is on earthly things, and that's not the earthly things like food, which you need, but it's excessive eating. And we know many people today, sadly, we don't understand them, have eating disorders. But some of them have brought it on themselves by really bad diet, excessive eating of sugary things, and setting up type 2 diabetes, people becoming obese because of all the types of food they eat with fat and sugar in them. So it's very, very shame. So sins of intemperance, meaning you're out of control. You're not controlling your drinking, so there's drunkenness. You're not controlling your eating and you're going out, you're partying, you're revelling, you're carousing, you're eating too much. So how much of these sorts of things apply to us today? Well, I should think probably both of them do apply to our society, but I certainly hope they don't apply to our churches, not to people in our churches. Well, up to you to decide if you know of any Christians who behave like that. Paul finishes with an expression, "and the like." He finishes this whole section on the acts of the sinful nature, having gone through all these, however many there are, and the like. In other words, what he has written here is neither a definitive list nor an exhaustive list. There are other things that could be added to these acts of the sinful nature. So the question is, what sins would you add to the acts of the sinful nature? That's a good question to debate, particularly if you're doing this as part of a house group. So, okay, concluding slide. Galatians 5:19-21 lists these acts of the sinful nature. And we said they fall into three different categories: sexual sins, religious deviations, disorders in personal relationships, and that was the longest list, sins of intemperance, and then this last one, very open-ended one, and the like. So to conclude, I would like to challenge you perhaps, what have you learned from this series? Yes, I've understood these acts of the sinful nature a bit better when I was preparing this, but what I have learned is that I have to keep an eye on myself. There are many of these things in these acts of sinful nature Many of them I have no trouble with at all. I've never been tempted by them. I can forget about them really because they're not an issue for me. But there are some where, well, I may have a bit of a weakness, and I have to watch myself, having learned this lot, to say, hang on, Mike, what about that one? And what about this one? You got to be careful. You could slip, you could backslide if you don't watch it. So, that's what I learned in this series, and I hope it's opened your eyes, perhaps not to understanding them better, but perhaps open your eyes to your own weaknesses, and so you can keep an eye on yourself, because all of us want to live a life that brings glory to our Lord Jesus Christ. May God bless you all. Thank you.